All right. Hi everyone. Welcome to this very special event. We are in conversation with Aakash Singh Rathore on his book Ambedkar's Preamble. Um, so, uh, Before I proceed with the substantive part of the conversation, I would like to introduce our panelist. First of all, thank you so much to our panelists for taking out time. I would first like to proceed and introduce Akash. Aakash Singh Rathore has a background in humanities and holds an LLM from the Central European Universities. He holds a PhD from Catholic University Leuven, and in the past he has taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He's a philosopher of international repute and has authored a number of books, including Ambedkar's Preamble, which we are going to discuss today. His forthcoming books include B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice, and B.R. Ambedkar, A Definitive Biography. Welcome, Akash.
Thank
Uh,
you so much.
the next panelist we have is Professor Nigam Nugihalli. Professor Nugihalli is a graduate from National Law School of India University. He holds an LM from New York University and a DPhil from the University of Oxford, which is in the field of legal philosophy. Professor Nigam has taught at LSIU and Azim Premji University before he joined BML Munjal University in the capacity of Dean at School of Law. While he's an expert in tax law, Professor Nigam is deeply interested in questions of law and philosophy and has designed and taught courses on the same. So, and just to introduce myself, I teach law at the BML Munjal University. My name is Anubhav Rajsekhar, and I shall be coordinating this event. So, just to start, we wanted to actually have this event in January, but this wasn't possible. We could not do it back then. But interestingly, it's also a great coincidence, and I'm very happy that we are having this in February, because February is a very important month in terms of development of our preamble. February 6th is a very important date, and February 21 is a very important date. Therefore, the debate and discussion within the drafting committee over the preamble happened in the month of February. So I think it's a very interesting coincidence. And with that, let me just start off with my first question, which I would direct to Mr. Rathore. And my question is, could you um, so this book is, it's a very interesting book, Ambedkar's Preamble, and in certain senses, it's a very unique book also, right? And its uniqueness lies in the fact that it is one of the rare attempts in which, the preamble, as you write, is sharply foregrounded, and the rest of the Constitution takes a back seat. So the book focuses on Dr. Ambedkar's preamble, and as it was adopted on 26 November 1945, and the exploration is limited to that. So, may I ask you that what promise does the preamble hold for the common Indian? Is it merely a symbol of a collective aspirations, or does it go beyond to aid the citizens in achieving justice, social, economic, or political?
Thank you, Anubhav. So I'll just give a brief response to you. I think we're doing like this. We're having a conversation.
Sure.
Okay. I have a tendency, as I suppose all of us who are professors do, to speak too long. So just just tell me if I am going off too far on a tangent in trying to answer your question. But your question is actually not. It's a very important one, but it doesn't pose a great challenge because, in a way, we saw during this very active period of protests that were happening in India just prior to the onset of the disastrous COVID pandemic. We saw so many citizens, common citizens, and groups of socially motivated students and common Indian people out. It's not the protest that I'm focusing on, it's the medium or the way they were channeling their events. They were out reading the preamble. I'm sure you remember that. And I found it quite a kind of confirmation, because I had finished the book on the preamble only maybe 7 months prior to watching people like Chandrasekhar Azad out and rallying thousands of people for readings of the preamble. And even far less radical protesters. They're very simple. I received photographs of families out reading the preamble together and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that the proof has already established itself that the preamble speaks to common people. In fact, I think that given the history, as the students of constitutional law would know, given the history of the court's somewhat tepid relationship to the preamble for the first 4 decades after the Republic, the way that the court finally, in the late 1970s, picked up the preamble as not only essential to the body of the Constitution, but also part of its inalterable basic structure. It almost seems that common Indian people, as well as the elite highest jurists, have started only in the last few decades to understand how integral the preamble is, not only to the idea of India at a level of abstraction, relevant to jurists and so on, but also to its everyday realities. So when we see an apex court citing the vital importance, inalterable importance of the preamble, and we see common people gathered around on the streets reading the preamble, we really see from top to bottom how crucial this document is to the pulse, the life of the Indian Republic. And that's why I wrote the book, instead of concentrating, as I say, I foreground the preamble and background the Constitution. There's, of course, another reason that I did that, and that's because there are so many excellent books on the Constitution, but there are very, very few on the preamble alone. So I hope that's an answer, Anubhav, for now.
So having established the significance of the preamble, let's just move to understand, let's just discuss a bit on the authorship. So I'm particularly interested in asking, how do you differentiate between an author and architect? Now, you specifically point out in the book that you do not want to go into most of this debate as you write, but for the sake of clarity for our audiences, since your book credits Ambedkar with the authorship, appreciating the difference would help us understand your claim better. So could you just clarify the difference?
Yeah, so let's use architect not as an analogous term, the way we use it when we refer to architect of the Constitution. Let's use it literally. Now, what does an architect do, literally? Does she bake bricks out of mud? Does she mix cement and lay foundations and so on? You're getting the idea. The architect's work is a work of trying to form material, given materials, and of course the architect will often be responsible for choosing materials, but not for their construction or creation. Keeping these materials in mind, trying to formulate ideas, figuring out how to create form out of matter. So the formal component is almost entirely within the mind and of course the experience of the architect, whereas the material component comes from the labor of numerous others. Now, given that an architect is not responsible for every brick, every piece of glass, every piece of steel, all of these things, when we look at constitution making, how does this analogy fit? Is it a one-to-one analogy, or are there certain nuances and so on? So the reason that I was wary of completely defining the functional role of architect versus author was because the analogy doesn't necessarily hold one-to-one. And so we're using an analogical term like architect. We want to be careful because on the one hand, to refer to someone as an architect can give them too little responsibility or recognition for the material components, or on the other hand, it can give them too much. Now, author is another similar problem. You had mentioned that I'm a philosopher. I also did LLB and a postdoc in constitutional law after the LLM. But my career has mostly been in political philosophy. As a philosopher, one understands the complexity of the term author. You know, there are in fact very famous works like The Death of the Author and a lot of deconstructionist and other philosophical views about the autonomy of an author. How much of a written work is an author responsible for? Well, certainly not the language. Let's assume that an author writes in Hindi or in English. That author did not invent Hindi nor English. So once again, the materials that are given, the raw materials, are given by history, community, and culture. But what makes an author is that she takes those pre-given materials, the language, the words, the syntax, the grammar, and she shapes them according to her own vision. So it's very similar to an architect in a certain extent. So now, given these complications of what we call architect and author, that is why I go step by step through who contributed what and how much and what significance it has. Because if I were just to say, Nehru referred to Ambedkar as the chief architect of the Constitution, and yet he is the author. As I've just spent 5 minutes explaining, neither of those terms really means anything unless you fill them in with some context and substance. So what this book is largely an attempt to give all of that context and substance so that you can see, fine, we call him Ambedkar the architect, we may call him the author, but what does that mean? Did he invent every word that's used in the preamble? No. Did he borrow from other documents? Yes. Can you be an author while borrowing from other documents? Well, it depends, right? As professors, we're often punishing our students for plagiarism when they're using other works without proper citation and reference. In fact, just as a funny aside, as I close this response to your question, the original preamble did have a footnote. It would have been the only preamble in the world, constitutional preamble, that had a footnote, but finally the drafting committee was wise enough to remove it. The footnote was not giving the source of the passages taken from other preambles and constitutions in the Indian preamble, but quite the opposite. It was a footnote designed to satisfy Nehru that and the Constituent Assembly that they tried as much as they could to stick within their mandate, but the times demanded that they use phraseology and ideas that were a bit distant from what the Constituent Assembly had tasked them with.
So just before I ask my next question, to the audience, I would request you, if you have any questions, please put it down in the chat box. We'll try to put it across to Aakash as many questions as possible in the last maybe 12 to 15 minutes. Now, I understand that the book has multiple. Sorry, my voice is echoing.
No, it's fine.
Okay. So, Aakash, would you just mute yourself because my voice is coming back to myself. So.
I see.
Yeah, much better. Thank you. So I was saying that the book has multiple themes, and of course, within a span of 1 hour, it is not possible to discuss all the themes, but we try to discuss a few very interesting themes. And one of the first theme that I would want to discuss is Ambedkar's Gandhi, actually. Because you discuss quite a bit, teasing out the relationship between Ambedkar and Gandhi. So my question to you is that, you write that Gandhi has shared a complex relationship with other epoch makers of his time, like Nehru, Tagore, and you mentioned Jinnah. So Ambedkar, after the death of Gandhi in 1955, in an interview about which you write, he wrote that, Ambedkar, he knew Gandhi better, and he said, "I saw the bare man in him. He showed me his fangs," right? And he says that very emphatically in that interview. It's available on YouTube for our audience to go and maybe hear Ambedkar speaking on Gandhi. So, who was Ambedkar's Gandhi, and what gave rise to such a complex relationship?
So, you know, Anubhav, you prefaced by saying it's difficult to put this discussion of an entire book into an hour. It's actually very difficult to put the entire Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship itself into an hour. Now, I'm going to respond in three ways. The first way is to talk about the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship from within the realm of opposing camps. So, as you very likely know, there were Gandhians and congressmen who had written fairly hostile books or treatises and pamphlets against Ambedkar, especially in the 1940s. And it continues onwards to this day, as I had written about in the book, a kind of, it's difficult to even characterize it, because you have intellectuals, activists, and devotees on both sides who parlay sorts of insults. So in this first level of response, I'll give you an example. I think maybe you won't be familiar with him, but there's a very well-known philosopher named Akhil Bilgrami who's at Columbia University. Akhil Bilgrami is very well known for his work on Gandhi. And I had written a chapter for a book that he was bringing out on, I think I might have entitled the chapter Ambedkar's Gandhi or something like this. And about a year after submitting this chapter, when I saw the final published book was sent to me by the publisher, I saw Professor Akhil's introduction. And in the introduction, he's a very eloquent writer. There's an elegant little remark that Aakash really doesn't understand Gandhi. Because if he had, he never would have written what he wrote in his chapter. Now, this kind of remark, which I don't mind, actually, Akhil is a close friend of mine, and I've counter-insulted him many times, but this kind of remark is something that we see all of the time. So there is a Gandhi-Ambedkar dispute that lives on decades after the historical dispute between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Now, from the Ambedkarite camp, the one thing I want to caution is how Ambedkarites have, for the last 20 years, been requesting, demanding, pleading the disengagement to stop discussing this debate. Because from the Ambedkarite point of view, the only time non-Ambedkarites wish to discuss Ambedkar is when they want to bring him to task on the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate. So there's a very common charge against anyone who now dispute, can you please just put it to rest? So this is one thing. It lives on, but we are trying to get past it. Now, the second is the actual relationship then. If that's about the legacy, the actual relationship. And the actual relationship of Ambedkar and Gandhi had a deep personal impact on Dr. Ambedkar, a very deep personal impact on Dr. Ambedkar. In fact, so deep, I believe, that it has yet to be adequately captured in popular biographies of Dr. Ambedkar. And as you may know, I'm currently writing a biography of Ambedkar, and because of the first point that I told you, I'm trying to restrain from properly, adequately discussing the impact and influence that Gandhi had on Ambedkar, because people from the Ambedkar camp are so tired of hearing it. And yet, having discovered in all of the literature that I don't think it has been properly established and explained how deeply Ambedkar was influenced by Gandhi. And this goes all of the way up to Gandhi's day of death and Ambedkar's notebooks, where he writes about how it influenced him, that this man, he called him a phenomenon, has now passed. And Ambedkar describes in his own diaries the day and following the hordes of people who are trying to get into the lines of processions of mourning and things like this. So till the day of Gandhi's death, he was very influential on Dr. Ambedkar. And if you go back to the early days of Gandhi, this is prior to Roundtable Conference and the flashpoint, the Pune Pact, where Gandhi and Ambedkar got pit as very polar enemies. If you go back to the 20s, you find that Ambedkar referred to himself as a satyagrahi. And Mahad, for example, this great struggle, Ambedkar himself referred to as the Mahad Satyagraha for drinking water from the tank. And he spoke about 3 different temple entry campaigns as satyagrahas. Now, this kind of vocabulary that Dr. Ambedkar used in the 1920s, showing that he was aligned with Gandhi's methods and principles of civil disobedience. These have been all neglected, sort of thrown out, because the Pune Pact and after is what people began to focus on. So now I've told you the second thing, that in the arc of Dr. Ambedkar's life, Gandhi remained an essential and crucial and pivotal figure. And then there's just an appendix to put on this second point, which is that when we read the way that Gandhi's own ideas changed, so as you probably know, in the 1920s, 1930s, Gandhi was rather persistently defending caste from its detractors, from social reformers and so on, who wanted to modernize and move beyond the caste system. Eventually, Gandhi realized that, or declared that caste is a kind of bastardization of the Varna system. And so Gandhi agreed that caste is something we need to get beyond, but Varna is a sort of pure version of this system. And then in the last 2 or 3 years of his life, he even set aside this idea, and he said that, no, this is something that that also needs to be transcended. Now, what is it that made Gandhi change from his being a proponent of caste to wanting to overcome caste and embracing Varna Dharma, to being a critic of Varna Dharma and wanting to declare that Indian social life should be organized on more egalitarian principles? It was always Ambedkar. It was always letters from Dr. Ambedkar. It was always visits from Dr. Ambedkar, arguments that they had one-on-one in person or through letters and communication. So another thing, and I've read all of the Gandhi biographies as well, another thing that is left out is not only how Gandhi influenced Dr. Ambedkar to the entire arc of Ambedkar's life. Of course, Gandhi is from an earlier generation, he's the elder, but how Ambedkar is crucially responsible for the way that that Gandhi's own ideas, especially about caste and Varna, evolved over 20 years of his own life. And now finally, the third point is more specific to the book. Gandhi was such a figure looming over the Constituent Assembly. As I mentioned, on the 4th of November, 1948, the president of the Assembly, Rajendra Prasad, inaugurated the proceedings by what is, there's no other word to call it, but a prayer to Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, it is basically a prayer to Mahatma Gandhi. And as I mentioned in the book, there were many Constituent Assembly members who wanted to take portions of that text and put it as the invocative part of the preamble of the Indian Constitution. And Ambedkar pushed back, and he said that we will neither invoke Gandhi nor God. The people are the source of sovereignty. But so Gandhi, as a looming figure over the Constituent Assembly, is thus a looming figure in the room, the closed room of the drafting committee itself. And so each time, especially with respect to the preamble, but many other things that end up in the directive principles of state policy, each time Gandhian ideas come up, these are something that Ambedkar has to parry. And he has to parry them in two different ways. One at the juridical level, and one at the personal level. What I was talking about, this personal struggle that Gandhi and Ambedkar had for all of those years, and it was a very bitter one. So, in these three ways, the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship is very, very profound, and it's something that, you know, I wish there was a sort of level playing field for someone to be able to write an exhaustive book about this relationship. The problem is, I don't think either camp wants it. Neither camp wants to see this book. So I'm not putting myself at risk by writing that one.
Thank you. Sure. Professor Nigam, I know because I work with Professor Nigam. So and I know that Professor Nigam has some very interesting thoughts on Gandhi. So I would welcome Professor Nigam to kindly join in and share his thoughts on this question.
Thank you, Anubhav, and welcome again, Aakash. It's lovely to have you here. I actually want to just preface whatever I'm going to say with some more introductory remarks in which you play a pivotal part, Aakash. We are at the Preamble Munjal Law School are actually trying to figure out how to teach legal and constitutional history to our students in such a way that they're fascinated by it, they're excited by it, they think of it as something that brings great value to their education. Because we found out, I mean, I was at the National Law School in its early years, and we had a great history teacher. In fact, until recently, she taught there. Anubhav has learned legal history as well in his curriculum. But the one thing we missed, and what's changing now in today's era, is there are lots of very interesting books on constitutional legal history, and indeed on the political history of India, and the more recent political history of India that are coming out. And that's helping our students get a more broad-based education in this. And I think that was missing in our time. So it's very important. I mean, I know I've been recently reading Jugalbandi by Vinay Sitapati. And then, Rohit Day has written excellent books on the Indian Constitution. And you have written this fascinating book on Ambedkar's Preamble. And I think all these are part of, in my opinion, a new revolution in the way we are engaging with legal history of India. And it's very much needed. If we don't do that, our students will quickly associate legal and constitutional history with some dry text or some more dangerously irrelevant information, and that is really inimical to the way we think they ought to understand the Indian Constitution. So a lot of this, I encourage all my students here. They're actually going through a legal history course in the law school as we speak, and I encourage all of them to read not your book, obviously, but also many other recent books in this area, which show how important legal history is to our understanding of our constitutional duties and responsibilities, and indeed the way India has progressed from the near pre-independence era to now. So though that was my preface, I wanted to say that because this is a tremendous opportunity, really, as legal educators, for us to recognize this important these kind of important efforts in the field by authors such as you. Coming to, and sorry for that, Anubhav, for that preamble, for my preamble to what you're going to ask. The other thing, so coming to the Gandhi thing again, in some ways, my life is my trajectory of legal scholarship has been quite incongruous in some ways. I have mixed tax and philosophy, and part of that incongruity in some ways is my fascination with Gandhi and Gandhian scholarship. You mentioned Akhil Bilgrami, wonderful author, and his writings on Gandhi are indeed some of the most interesting writings I have seen on the subject. I think I echo your thoughts on the kind of, in some ways, incorrigible disputes between the two camps, Ambedkar and Gandhi. And I also agree with you that there is a need for scholarship in this area, and in fact there's in some ways a space for trying to figure out what exactly were the differences in ideology and in philosophy between Ambedkar and Gandhi. As you rightly put it, it will take years for us to talk about it, but I think one thing that I've always been fascinated about, something that you allude to in your book, Aakash, is that Gandhi and Ambedkar appear to have very different views on how to organize our lives. Gandhi wanted to organize it along his ideal village republics, and Ambedkar thought of Indian villages as sinks of imperialism and discrimination. And I wonder, and this is something that I think, in fact, I might want to ask you today. I wonder if the difference there, and I think this might progress our conversation forward as well, that the difference in the way Gandhi and Ambedkar looked at governance is that Gandhi was a bit skeptical of the role of politics itself. He thought that, and when I say role of politics, I mean role of modern politics, with the state as central to politics, with the modern welfare state as central to politics. And because of that skepticism, the idea that a modern welfare state is not really necessary for his views on Swaraj. And whereas I think Ambedkar, with his views on equality, liberty, fraternity, but all of these views appear to have the modern welfare state at the center of governance. And it could be that their political differences were in some ways aligned or assigned on those lines, some state skepticism on the part of Gandhi's part, and on the part of Ambedkar, actually great optimism in the power of the state, provided the right conditions are there, in the power of the modern welfare state to do great good in governance. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Aakash, do you want to respond to that, or should I proceed with if you have anything to add there, so just take your thoughts.
Well, I think that's 100% correct what Professor Nigam said, especially the remarks about skepticism regarding the capacities and promise that lies in a modern welfare state. One just has to read Hind Swaraj of Gandhi to see how deep that skepticism is. And that's a very early text of Gandhi's, of course, but 1909, so 3.5 decades later, Gandhi is still insisting to Nehru that Nehru's not studying that book enough. So as he's trying to put together the modern Indian Republic.
In fact, that letter to Nehru is a prescribed reading in one of my courses.
I see.
So it talks a little bit about Hind Swaraj and tells him go back and read it again. So that's
yeah. So that really summarizes your point. This is something Gandhi long believed, and it wasn't that. I mean, Nehru found this a bit unrealistic, but unrealism can be seen in two ways. One is that one is not aware of the challenges, and one is that one is aware of the challenges and pushes forward anyway. And Gandhi falls into that latter group. He was very well aware of the modern world's demands, and yet he remained committed to his ideas and that deep skepticism of the modern and especially the nation state. It's a very common thing, and I myself, when I look back at my books from 2017, I wrote a book called Indian Political Theory, where I discuss Gandhi and Ambedkar. And in that work, I refer to Ambedkar as an Enlightenment modernist, as opposed to Gandhi, who has this orientation towards village Swaraj. And now I realize that this is quite incorrect. One of the things that made me see this was going back and reading Dr. Ambedkar's 25th November 1949 speech to the Constituent Assembly, where Dr. Ambedkar reads passages from a letter of Thomas Jefferson to Madison in the United States about the Constitution. The letter is about how Jefferson advises Madison that every generation needs a new revolution. And this is in respect to one generation binding the next generation to the ideas of the Constitution. And I find this, quite frankly, baffling. It's baffling that Dr. Ambedkar, the following day, the Constituent Assembly votes and enacts the Constitution, which Dr. Ambedkar has for almost 2 years so painstakingly, daily labored over. And as he's making the motion for its adoption, he states that one generation cannot bind another generation, and that every generation needs a revolution. Now, 11 paragraphs later in that same speech, Dr. Ambedkar criticizes Gandhians, and he uses that very famous grammar of anarchy sentence. And what I found is that everybody, including myself, in 2017, my position in Indian political theory, everybody fixates on Ambedkar's critique of Gandhi and critique of village Swaraj and so on as being equivalent to his pro-modern Enlightenment, pro-welfare state, pro-nation state position. And so we ignore what Ambedkar is saying in the third paragraph of that same speech. And I've looked through it, and I have not seen any secondary source, no writings that I can find that attempt to understand what is Dr. Ambedkar trying to say in this warning. He calls it his last warning to the Constituent Assembly, that every generation needs a revolution. Now, so I just want to say that while I myself, I don't think, Professor Nigam, you were making a dualism, but while I myself have tended to often make this dualism, I think we have to be very, very careful about how committed Dr. Ambedkar was to the idea of the state as an eternally essential part of human governance and human life. This, of course, comes back in 1956 with conversion, because once again, he moves from out of the apparatus, working within the apparatus of the Constitution and the state, into a completely sort of private domain that then takes on such large-scale political significance. So in some way, Dr. Ambedkar's own life from 1948 to 1956 shows an evolution away from complete fidelity or faith in the welfare state. It doesn't. Who knows what another 10 years of life would have done? It doesn't come anywhere near Gandhi's position, but you can see the art starts to move in that direction.
So while I do have a number of themes, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to drop a few questions because I would really like our audience to, I'm sure they're very excited to ask you questions. But one question that I would put to you is with regards to the American influence on Ambedkar. If you look at the preamble that you find in States and Minorities. The preamble in itself, the language that it uses, it appears that Ambedkar was actually very influenced by the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, because it uses words like, ordained, united. It makes a constitution for the United States of India. The other phrases are secure the blessings, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and maybe a couple of others, right? So, could you help us understand how Ambedkar could have been influenced by the American liberal democratic thought? Because although you do mention in the book regarding his professors, but I don't think there is a substantive engagement with regards to American influence, or why this particular preamble in States and Minorities reflects so much of American influence. But later on, when you get the preamble in sixth, of course, do discuss why there has been a change or what could be the possible justification. But I'm particularly asking regarding the preamble in State and Minorities. Why does it have America written all over it? I mean, it appears that he's quite influenced.
Including the title, United States of India, right? So there are a couple, I mean, there are many things that can be said about it. I think I like to look at things pragmatically. Imagine yourself writing the Constitution from beginning to end. No drafting committee, no secretary, no word processor for cut and paste. You're writing a constitution yourself from beginning to end. And Dr. Ambedkar wrote States and Minorities single-handed, and it's a massive document. So from merely pragmatic point of view, I think a lot of the passages that you're referring to come from the fact that he's working at his desk by himself, drafting this thing with these sorts of constitutional handbooks and manuals that he got from his years in the United States at his side. So that's one thing. That's in a way to play down whether he spiritually and mentally was totally preoccupied with this constitutional and political legacy, or whether it was just the circumstances of writing it on his own. Because as you see, when you are cooperating with other people, there's a great deal of synergy. So even two people can get much more done than one person individually plus one person individually. So if he had to write this document, it's 25,000 words long. So that's just one thing. The second thing is, of course, to pay more attention to these ideas. And in Ambedkar's preamble, I don't have any space to do that. But in the Ambedkar biography that I'm writing now, in fact, I just finished the chapter about Dr. Ambedkar's time at Columbia University, and I was fortunate to go through the archive. So now I see every single class that he had taken, as well as the syllabus. I can see the books that were assigned by each professor, and I have gone through each of the university archives to find out which courses he opted for. Like, in other words, what were mandatory courses of the program and what were electives, and which electives he selected and so on. And by tracing all of this out, what I can see is that John Dewey, the American pragmatist philosopher, was the most decisive thinker on the development of Ambedkar's thoughts. And you can think of something as totally radical as Annihilation of Caste, 1936. Now, this looks like a document that only Ambedkar could write, and only someone who's at the height of his sort of righteous indignation about the system he finds himself in. And yet, one finds actually entire passages copied out from John Dewey's 1920 I'm sorry, I don't remember the year of John Dewey's book, Democracy and Education, 1909. So what we see is that no matter where you least expect it, Dewey's thoughts on law, society, and politics, art, education, and morality are constantly coming out of Dr. Ambedkar's pen. And so that's the more substantive thing. So in a way, the first part of the answer was procedural. I don't think it means as much as you think just because of the circumstances. And the second is there is a way in which Deweyan ideas were always at the heart of Ambedkar's ideas, except updated to the circumstance. And so the remaining piece of the puzzle is how influenced Dewey himself was by the American experience. And there's a certain way within which philosophers do refer to John Dewey, along with William James, as the American philosopher. So all of the political values of Democracy in Action, which is another book by John Dewey, are captured from the late 18th century experience in Dewey. And so Ambedkar got a lot of this not by studying the so-called founding fathers of the American constitutional experience, but by his professors at Columbia who left such a deep impact on him.
That's really fascinating to hear. I don't know whether Anubhav is having some trouble connecting, but in the meantime, Aakash, can you hear me?
Yes, I see he's disappeared.
Yes, I think I'm sure he'll be back. One thing I wanted to tell you was that these are the kind of nuggets of information that one normally never gets when you read legal history. So, for example, I was really excited to read about John Dewey's influence on Ambedkar, and now that you think of it, the connections you make between some of Ambedkar's works and John Dewey is something worth exploring. Plus, kind of poignant and almost tragic set of events that you mention in your book, that by the time he could go back to Columbia in the 50s, John Dewey had died, I think the day before or a couple of days before he arrived in Columbia. So that was another thing that I found quite interesting to read. I think we have some, we only have about 10 minutes left. So I think we should go to the audience and see if they have any questions for you. I'm just going to read out questions randomly. So please excuse me if some of you are not able to get your chance. Anubhav, I've just gone to the audience questions for Aakash. So there's one question from Fahad Khan, who says, this is to Dr. Rathore. He says, are there any particular scholarly challenges involved in reading the ideas of historic personalities into the language of the Constitution and the law? How do you see works like your book shaping the boundaries of legal studies and legal thought?
What a fascinating question. I've given hundreds of talks, dozens on this book, and I've never been asked a question like that. That's really fascinating. Since I've never been asked, I'm actually going to think about that more, and we can keep in touch maybe on I'll put my email in the chat before we close. If anyone has some lingering things and we couldn't you couldn't ask your question, feel free to email. Now, immediate response, just this week, I think on Sunday, Outlook magazine is carrying an article of mine. I don't remember the title of it, but it's essentially a review of 4 or 5 recent books in legal and constitutional history, including the ones that Professor Nigam had mentioned, along with Aakash Singh's 16 Stormy Days and Gautam Bhatia's Transformative Constitution. And so I go through and I review, because it is remarkable how 2019 and 2020 just saw an avalanche of high quality, high profile books on Indian constitutional and legal history. I think it was one of the most fruitful years last 2 years in this field. Why I'm referring to this article, in case you're interested in reading it, although Outlook magazine, I found out, has put a 5 rupees firewall. So you have to actually pay 5 rupees to read it. And I mean, it's not the 5 rupees, it's going to the process of paying the 5 rupees that is, I think, so I haven't myself looked at the article to see how it came out because I don't want to pay the 5 rupees. But the reason I raised this issue is because what I do is I don't just review these books, I review these books in the light of the question you asked, which is what does this new flood of high quality scholarship with respect to legal and constitutional history, what does it mean for India today? So I was giving a talk at IIT Delhi a few months ago, and a person in the audience raised her hand and she said, you keep talking about the preamble and the Constitution as some profound and magical document. I don't think it's very special. And I was a bit taken aback by the question, but then I started to see that she was merely echoing something that is really coming around now and again by various elements of the social world that is not from the left. It's actually from the right. And that is what is so interesting, because there have long been radical left critiques of the constitutions to, the state formation and things like that. We've heard that for decades, but very recently we're now hearing critiques from the right that the constitution is too focused on egalitarian justice and the question was essentially, why should the executive be fettered by issues of liberty and justice when he needs to take care of security? So we're seeing these critiques of the Constitution by the public emerging in a way that I think we haven't seen in many years. And we're seeing at the same time a flood of very sophisticated elaborations of the significance of the Constitution on the other hand. So it's interesting how these two things are happening right now in front of us. And that's what I've written about in the Outlook article. So if you don't mind the 5 rupees thing, I'll pay you back if I can. Have a look at that. That might give you some response to your question. I'll try to be brief. I know we're running out of time. I warned you that I speak too much.
Thank you. Professor Nigam, actually, I do not have the questions. I got disconnected. So maybe you want to choose the next question as well. So you're on mute, so please kindly unmute.
Sure, sorry. There are actually a number of questions from Harshita, and I'll ask one of it. I think this might be something that might be easily answered by Aakash, so I'll ask that question. I have often read that the ideals behind the preamble of India, of the Indian Constitution, were laid down by Nehru's objective resolution, which was adopted by the Constituent Assembly. So if that is so, why isn't it called Nehru's preamble?
Well, it is called Nehru's preamble. That's the reason that I wrote the book. Now, each of us is online. You can do something. It will be finished in 5 minutes. As soon as we are done, I want you to Google who wrote the preamble to the Constitution. And if you leave aside the hits, the responses, the search results that reference my book, then all of the other responses are going to be that Nehru wrote the preamble to the Constitution. That was part of the reason why I wrote this book, because I knew better that the authorship of the preamble was a very complicated phenomenon, but the moral center of this preamble does not belong in the history of the drafting of the Objectives Resolution, which incidentally I get into the book to show that even Nehru didn't write the Objectives Resolution. So it's doubly problematic to make that claim that Nehru is the author of the preamble because he's the author of the Objectives Resolution. The Objectives Resolution was written by 5 people, including Humayun Kabir, who I think made a very significant impact on it. So if you just Google who wrote the preamble, you're going to see everybody says it's Nehru. But the moral center of the preamble really comes down to two words, dignity and fraternity, that have not appeared in any previous document, including the Objectives Resolution. Any of the source documents, they're completely absent from there, and they're really what form the heart of the preamble, I think. The dignity of every citizen of India and fraternity between us. So these two words being contributed not only by Ambedkar's as an author, but by Ambedkar's lifespan as a whole, his quest for dignity and his demand for fraternity, even the way he treated others who were insulting and abusing him. These form the center of the preamble in a very decisive way, and that's why I call the book Ambedkar's Preamble.
Professor Nigam, you're on mute, so shall we take one more question, or should we wrap up?
No, I think we probably will have to wrap up because we are at the end of the session. So, Anubhav, over to you. I think I'll only request Aakash to give his his correspondence details, because I'm sure many of my you already done it. So many of my our students would be eager to know more about this, and this is a great opportunity for them to correspond with you. But over to you, Anubhav.
Thank you. So, everyone, this is the book. I'm sure many of you have already seen the cover and many of you have already read it. But in case you haven't, and I'm sure this conversation would have definitely ignited some interest in the book and the themes. So I request you to go out, please buy yourself or just order it online, considering circumstances, and read it. I think it's a very important contribution to legal history and the way we perceive it. So I think since we have reached the end of this discussion, I would like to thank Aakash for joining us here today, taking out time, talking to our audience, and Professor Nigam, of course, for supporting us in this endeavor, and our entire team, IT team, media team. And from the School of Law, I would like to mention Urmi, who has been supporting us in coordinating this event also. So thank you so much once again. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can have you on campus with us very soon with your next book coming out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Nigam and Anubhav, for organizing this, and all of the people who helped you to do it. And I'm so happy to see, I see more than 50 participants. I hope it was a good session, and do read the book if you can. And feel free to email me. I've put the address in the chat box. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.